Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Sandy Smith, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Commander Lee Pritchard. We warmly welcome the group representing the Windsor RSL sub-branch and also RSL Tasmania. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Returned and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Services Clubs Association. We welcome members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by visitors to the memorial. If you are able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's first World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who gave their lives for us in war and on operations for over a century. But first, we present a lament. Flowers of the forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Lieutenant William Norman Eric Scott. William Scott was born in 1894, the youngest son of Arthur and Margaret Scott of Melbourne. He went on to work as an electrical engineer and was a keen sportsman. Scott was one of the best-known members of the Melburnian Hare and Hounds Amateur Athletics Association and won a number of his club's long-distance events. He also served in his local regiment of the Australian Field Artillery for 2 years. William Scott enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force shortly after the outbreak of war in August 1914. It was reported that he was in camp at Broadmeadows with the artillery the memorable first Sunday the camp was opened for public inspection in September 1914. After a period of training in Australia, Bombardier William Scott left Australia for active service overseas with the 1st Contingent on the 20th of October 1914. A member of the 2nd Field Artillery Brigade, he continued training in the desert after his arrival in Egypt. The 2nd Field Artillery Brigade left Mina Camp at the base of the pyramids on 8th of April 1915, bound for Gallipoli with a stop at the island of Lemnos on the way. They arrived at Gallipoli around 8 a.m. on the 25th of April 1915. With the infantry fighting on the heights above the beach, the men of the 2nd Field Artillery Brigade struggled to bring their guns ashore as quickly as possible. Scott remained on the peninsula for the duration of the Gallipoli campaign. Aside from a brief period in hospital after the evacuation, he remained with the brigade as it transferred to France and began to participate in operations on the Western Front. In late April 1917, Scott was successful in transferring to the Australian Flying Corps and began training as an air observer. He was commissioned 2nd Lieutenant on the 23rd of June and continued undertaking training courses in wireless radio, observation and gunnery. He was sent to France to join his squadron in August 1917. At the time Scott arrived at the front, the British were conducting the Third Battle of Ypres, also known as Passchendaele, on the Ypres salient in Belgium. The weather was wet and windy more often than not, and the sodden battlefield became a quagmire of mud and debris. On the 2nd of December 1917, a wet and windy day, a German artillery battery was causing a significant number of casualties in the Allied lines. It was determined urgent and important to locate the German battery so that it could be put out of action. At the time, the most effective method of locating hidden guns was by air, but weather conditions were extremely dangerous for the delicate and temperamental flying machines. One aeroplane had already crashed on its way to locate the battery, and Scott's officer, Captain Harry Storer, was asked to send a plane to do the job. Storer decided the weather conditions were so bad he could not ask one of his men to go, and so piloted the aircraft himself. He could not do the task alone, however, and Lieutenant William Scott went with him as his observer. There was a strong wind blowing across the runway at an awkward angle, making the operation extremely dangerous. Scott and Storer managed to take off, but a gust of wind meant that Storer had to swerve to avoid some trees. The engine began to lose revs as a result, and the aircraft looked to be in danger of falling on nearby buildings and shops. To avoid this, Storer took a second sharp turn, but the gusty wind caught the tail of the plane and it crashed into the brick wall of the Bayeux Cemetery. Observer Lieutenant William Scott was still alive when rescuers reached the crash site, but he died within half an hour. Captain Harry Storer was killed on impact. The two were buried in the cemetery into whose wall they had crashed. Today, Lieutenant William Scott's remains lie in the Bayeux Communal Cemetery extension next to those of Harry Storer. He was 23 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. A photograph of his headstone is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Lieutenant William Norman Eric Scott, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor their years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support during the memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening.